Well, good morning, everyone. It's so good to see you, and a special thank you to Eagle Forum for the opportunity to speak with you all today. When I first moved to DC a few years ago, the very first podcast I hosted at the organization I was with at the time was entitled Phyllis Schlafly Was Right, and I stand by it today. She's been vindicated, I think, on every front, and today's only further testament to that. So as we begin, I want to take a moment to recognize that, statistically speaking, you or someone that you know has either used in vitro fertilization to conceive a child or is perhaps the product of IVF themselves. And so I want to be very, very clear. Each child, no matter how he or she was conceived, is made in the image and likeness of God. Their life is a gift and a blessing to all of us here today. And it is because we value unborn life so very much from that moment of conception that it is so important that we discuss the complexities of in vitro fertilization today. Now, when we say, let's talk about IVF, people often hear, let's talk about whether or not you can have a baby. And this miscommunication places people in a defensive position right away, where it feels like the conversation is about whether or not they have the right or the ability to have a child. And as you saw this past year, the resulting conversation can quickly become tense, emotional, and frankly just unproductive when it's framed in that lens. Now, of course, that's not what is being said, but it can often feel that way when you're in the thick of it, especially if you are dealing with infertility. And so that is why it is so important in policy and law especially to be very clear about what we hope to achieve in that conversation. What is our goal policy-wise? What is our goal culturally? So is it merely to expand access to IVF, which is what much of the political discourse has been on this past year, or is it to help men and women address their infertility so that they can have the children that they desire? And while these questions are very similar and may have very similar outcomes, the question is key when it comes to shaping our response on the issue, because it leads us to two very different approaches and ways of thinking about infertility. Now, I am pro-life, staunchly so, and I imagine that most of you here today are too. And so the question isn't, do we want more babies or do we value babies? Because of course we do. This is precisely why we care deeply about helping couples have the children that they desire, while also prioritizing the well-being of mothers and children from that moment of conception. And we likewise have a duty to ensure that our laws protect the most vulnerable. And in vitro fertilization is a perfect example of that. So a couple of months ago, in the height of the IVF discourse, and I'll pause to say that when Heritage first hired me, I was convincing them that they should hire me to talk about IVF and bioethics. And I said, trust me, guys, this is going to become a very big deal. You have no idea. And then a couple of months later, for better and for worse, I was vindicated. And so that's made my job quite secure, thankfully. But one of my friends pulled me aside and she gave me permission to share this story today. But she's in her mid-20s and she found out a year or two ago that her mother is not her biological mother. When her mother and father went to have children, they had waited a little too long. Her eggs were no longer viable, and so they actually used her sister's eggs to conceive their children. So her biological mother is her aunt, and her mother, who has raised her and loved her unconditionally, is no less her mother, but now has a slightly different relationship to keep in mind. But on top of that, she specifically told her that there were still a few embryos that were frozen that they had never used. And that was 26 years ago. They're pro-life and they did not want to destroy the embryos, but they also were no longer able to use them themselves. And so she asked her, as she was preparing to get engaged to her fiance, if she, the daughter, would like to use the embryos to give her siblings a chance at life. And as you can imagine, the gravity of that request is massive, because it means now that the decisions that the parents made in good faith to have children are now being put on the children to ultimately decide the fate of their own siblings. What does it mean for a sister to gestate and birth her sibling? Is she confining them to certain death if she says no? Is she creating a very, frankly, weird dynamic with her siblings if she says yes? And these are the sort of moral complexities that are becoming very common in the United States because of our rampant use of these technologies with very little thought about the unintended consequences that can come from them. So, as we consider that question, I want to talk about in vitro fertilization in four sections. The first is to talk about what infertility is and how that shapes our approach to this discussion. The second is to talk about IVF itself, how it's practiced, and what we need to understand about this technology. The third is to consider the fertility industry, the larger movement of clinics in the United States regulating this practice. And then finally, we'll conclude with a broader look at the policies governing this conversation. So, as many of you probably know, infertility is on the rise across the United States. 1 in 5 married women aged 15 to 49 with no prior births are unable to get pregnant after a year of trying. And overall, 11% of women and 9% of men in the US have been diagnosed with infertility. We often feel like this is a mystery, this unexplained infertility, and that it is beyond our control. But it doesn't need to be this way. So doctors, researchers, and lawmakers alike tend to present IVF as a treatment for infertility, and particularly infertility as a disease. But this is misleading in a couple of respects. Because first, infertility is not actually a disease. It's a symptom of underlying conditions. And now these underlying conditions include things like a person's age, the loss of reproductive function, or other reproductive health conditions. And as you can imagine, these reproductive health conditions are many and varied for men and women. Yes, so exactly, from toxins to our environmental factors. For women in particular, this can look like conditions such as endometriosis, adenomyosis, PCOS, hormonal imbalances, blocked fallopian tubes, and lifestyle conditions, including a woman's age. And for men, these reproductive health conditions include things like low sperm count, low sperm motility, erectile dysfunction, their diet, their lifestyle, and other environmental factors. But interestingly, while we tend to think of infertility as a female problem, or more particularly a female problem, research is very clear that men and women bear the cause of infertility equally. So usually if a couple is diagnosed with infertility, about a third of the time it's due to the woman, a third of the time it's due to the man, and the final third, it's actually a mix of the two of them. And in most cases, you're dealing with 4 or more reproductive health conditions when someone is diagnosed with infertility. So to simply say infertility is a disease, therefore IVF solves it, actually overlooks the entire complexity of this diagnosis, and in many ways does a disservice to the men and women struggling with infertility. Because instead of providing them with an answer and with a way to heal their infertility, we're just giving them a one-size-fits-all solution that may or may not actually work. And to that point, IVF does not actually heal or restore these underlying conditions that cause infertility. It actually circumvents the man and the woman's body altogether. So they may successfully conceive embryos in a laboratory by fertilizing the egg with sperm in a petri dish, which is what IVF is. But if the man and woman's body is left untouched, then that embryo may or may not be able to implant. If you have blocked fallopian tubes or hormonal imbalances in particular, your miscarriage rate is going to be just as high as if you were trying to naturally conceive. So while IVF may work in conceiving embryos in a certain setting, it may or may not actually improve the couple's chances of having a baby. So in this way, IVF bypasses the body rather than treating its underlying conditions. And worse, couples gain little understanding of their bodies. They're not actually growing in their knowledge and appreciation for their bodies. The bodies are just getting separated and dismissed altogether. And so once we come to this, I think it's really important to then understand what IVF is. Beyond the basic definition of it's fertilizing sperm with egg in a petri dish in a laboratory, it's so much more complicated than that. So there are many variations when it comes to assisted reproductive technology, how you fertilize the egg with sperm, where you place it in the woman's body. But by and large, traditional IVF, like I've described it, makes up 99% of all reproductive technology procedures in the US. So when you say assisted reproductive technology, IVF is actually a perfectly sufficient synonym to cover it because that's the majority of the procedures taking place. So a few overall facts about IVF. A single cycle of IVF in the United States can cost anywhere from $12,000 to $30,000. And a cycle refers to the process that doctors use to conceive the embryos. So you take the sperm from the man, egg from the woman, you try to see how many embryos you create, and one round of that is anywhere from $12,000 to $30,000. And on average, it is estimated that it costs about $61,000 to either achieve a live birth or decide that such efforts aren't going to work. So that's about 2.5 rounds of IVF, and it's a significant financial burden for people who are pursuing children through that means. Now, as you're fertilizing egg in a petri dish, about 80% of those eggs will result in an embryo. And about 80% of those embryos will actually mature to a viable place to be considered for implantation. And once an embryo is created, there are only 5 options that parents have. Parents can choose to implant the embryo, freeze the embryo, destroy the embryo, donate the embryo to research, which is the same thing as destroying it, because after 14 days, experimental embryos must be destroyed. Or finally, place the embryo up for adoption through something called snowflake adoption. So there aren't really many options. Once you've created those embryos, you have 5 options before you. And if you're pro-life and would prefer not to destroy the embryos, you really only have 2 options, to either implant the embryo or place the embryo up for adoption. Now, in the United States, we don't have exact numbers on this, but it's estimated that there are about 1 million embryos frozen in the United States. So 1 million persons at that earliest stage of development who were frozen, suspended really, in this state where they're not able to continue growing or progress inside the womb of a woman, but they're also still alive, just sort of waiting for the next step. And certainly after a certain period of time, they will perish naturally, but we're getting reports of embryos as old as 30 years old actually being born into the world. So the length of time is really unknown per embryo. And beyond that, once you've created embryos, standard practice in the United States involves a number of moral complexities. So in many cases, this really amounts to eugenics. So in the United States, there are roughly 450 fertility clinics. About 75% of those clinics offer something called pre-implantation genetic testing. Now, pre-implantation genetic testing allows scientists to actually test the embryo's genetics to discern things like the sex of the embryo or any health conditions the embryo may have, such as Down syndrome or Tay-Sachs disease. And in some of the more advanced genetic tests that are becoming available, scientists are even trying to discern the intelligence of the embryo before they've even had a chance to be born and formed with their parents. And in particular, 73% of all of those fertility clinics offer PGT, or genetic testing, for sex selection. So there was a very prominent article in Slate magazine a few months ago where the entire discussion was on women in the United States intentionally using IVF, even though they did not have a diagnosis of infertility, so that they could choose the sex of the baby. And unlike China, they were preferring girls. So we actually have a high rate of individuals choosing IVF electively so that they can choose the sex of their child. Something that all of us in this room would say was outrageous when we had sex-based abortions in China, and yet has been allowed to continue with very little opposition throughout the entire fertility industry in the United States. And the availability of this genetic testing all but guarantees the creation and destruction of embryos in pursuit of the perfect or desired child, based on these features such as sex, their physical traits, their mental acuity, or even the potential of that child inheriting a certain disease or not. So overall, the most recent data we have on IVF in the United States comes from the CDC in 2021. And so they show that there were a little over 238,000 cycles of IVF, patients, resulting in over 413 cycles of IVF. Now, we don't actually track how many embryos are created in IVF. We only talk about the cycles. So a single cycle could involve the creation of one embryo, or a cycle could involve the creation of 20 or 25 embryos, as some have reported. It really just depends. So when we say over 413,000 cycles, that can mean anywhere from 500,000 children to 4 million children or more created in a single year in the United States. Overall, when it comes to our birth rates, about 2.3% of all infants born in the United States were conceived using assisted reproductive technology. And so if you take just a basic understanding of the data we have, IVF itself has fairly low success rates. The younger your eggs are, the higher your success rate, but most people using IVF are doing so either in response to a reproductive health condition like endometriosis or because they're further advanced in their age. So overall, IVF has about a 23% success rate for all demographics, but for women 40 and older, that success rate number drops to below 10%. So when IVF is presented as a, quote, solution to infertility, it's really misleading. Many women, especially in this past year, have come out saying, I was told I could delay childbearing to pursue my career, to work on other things at the time, and just have children through this magical technology, only to wake up one day and realize that that technology has a very low success rate and can't actually guarantee the children that they would have had much earlier had they known that was a factor. And as I mentioned, these embryo cycle rates don't include the total number of embryos created. And so the success rate of 23% only deals with embryos actually implanted in the womb. It doesn't talk about the success rate of all embryos created. And because we don't have exact data on that, it's hard to give a precise number, but there's a few different studies, one that we did at Heritage, some that have been done in the United Kingdom, looking at the average number of embryos created in a cycle, estimated maybe around 8 to 10, and then multiplying that by the total number of cycles. So if we take just a conservative number and say 10 embryos are created per cycle, and this will make up for fewer in some and much more in other cycles, what you're looking at is the creation of over 4.1 million embryos, as I mentioned. And if you take the number of live births, which is about 97,000 children born from IVF every year, and compare that with the 4.1 million embryos created every year, you're looking at an IVF success rate of 2.3% for embryos involved. So for those of us who believe that life begins at conception and genuinely want to protect and promote life, IVF has a very low success rate for those children. And for those children who are thankfully born and welcomed into the world, IVF confers additional health risks to both the mother and the child. So children who are conceived with IVF have higher rates of preterm birth, low birth rate, cerebral palsy, cancer, minor cleft palate, and congenital heart defects. Not enough that it makes it a public health crisis, but significantly higher than naturally conceived children. On top of that, these children are 4 times more likely to be born through a stillbirth or be diagnosed with autism. And they have a 40% chance of non-chromosomal birth defects overall. And similarly, a mother's health fares much worse with IVF. Very harsh drugs are used in the process to prepare her body to receive the embryo, and the additional stress of this can confer multiple conditions. So on average, the risk of preeclampsia increases by about 50%, and women are much more likely to undergo medically necessary C-sections. They also have higher rates of gestational diabetes, experience severe maternal morbidity, morbidity at higher rates of severe postpartum hemorrhage or ovarian simulation. So when I was actually pregnant with my most recent daughter, they asked me if I had used IVF to conceive my children because my chances of a hemorrhage are higher, for other reasons actually. But those are one of the things they look out for in the doctor's office. And if you have higher rates for certain things, they assume that you've used this technology, which isn't to say, again, that it's necessarily wrong. Mothers will do anything to have and protect the children that they love. But it does mean that we need to consider the implications and the sort of unintended consequences of these technologies. In particular, an Anglican bioethicist, Oliver O'Donovan, I think says it really well, where he says that there's a world of a difference between accepting the risk of a disabled child, where that risk is imposed upon us by nature, so naturally occurs, and then ourselves imposing that risk in pursuit of our own happiness. It's one thing to say, I've conceived a child who has these issues, and I will accept them and love them unconditionally. But it's another if we as parents are intentionally conceiving children in a way where we know we're giving them a higher risk of conceiving any number of medical issues. And that's something that we must consider, particularly as parents who have a moral responsibility to steward the well-being of our children. And so some of the resulting moral quandaries that come with this include sperm donation, where fathers can actually conceive hundreds of children, simply having their sperm available at a local sperm bank. This results in unknown siblings and really complicated dating questions, where in some small towns where the same sperm father has been used repeatedly, some children have found out that they actually dated their half-sibling. And this sounds insane, but it's becoming a situation in certain towns where you actually have to do genetic testing before you start dating people because you don't know who you're related to. So very bizarre family relationships that are forming. There's something known as savior siblings, where parents intentionally use IVF to conceive children who will have similar blood types or bone marrow to save the life of a child they already have. That's a not uncommon situation. As well as the complexity of what happens when you conceive a child 20 years ago, but that child isn't born until 20 years later. What does that do for our conception of time and what it means to grow up and be part of a family? So these are just a few of the sort of moral quandaries that are already inherent in the practice in the United States today and are not being adequately considered from policymakers or the general public. And so shifting a little bit, that gives you a big picture understanding of IVF as it's routinely practiced in the United States. Certainly there are exceptions to that. To really placing this in the context of the fertility industry overall. So the fertility industry in the United States includes in vitro fertilization, egg and sperm donation, as well as commercial surrogacy. And there's a few things that I think are important to know about this industry. And then certainly people who are working at clinics, who are involved in it, I think in most cases have the best intentions, right? They're here as medical providers who want to help families, and they're doing so with the knowledge that they've been given. However, there is a distinction between how the industry is run and how the individual medical providers are approaching the situation. So the fertility industry in the United States is a multi-billion-dollar self-regulated enterprise that profits from the creation and selection of human life. As I said, not all are bad actors by any means, but there are bad incentives baked into the model we currently have. Not only, as I said, the industry combines self-regulation with profit and the creation of human life under a single umbrella, with very little oversight from outside laws or regulations to hold them accountable to providing the best care that they can to couples. I don't have to tell you guys living in Alabama that in many ways is the heart of the situation that caused the court to rule on children who were destroyed through negligence of the fertility court. And largely, fertility clinics across the United States just are not held responsible for their treatment of the embryos that have been entrusted to their care. And in 2022, the global reproductive technology industry was valued at over $35 billion. So there is a lot of money to be made here, which isn't bad, but it does create a very particular incentive structure. So there's three distinctions I want to briefly make. The first is there's a difference between medical care and the fertility industry. Medical care focuses on treating diseases and healing an individual's health. The fertility industry focuses on providing people with a child, which is a good endeavor, but it shapes the particular way they go about it. Rather than treating the disease like we talked about, they're focused on using whatever means necessary to create a child. And their ultimate aim is profit maximization, not necessarily the best medical care. And so notably, most IVF clinics in the United States are owned by capital, investors across the spectrum, not physicians or hospital practices. So you're dealing with an industry of venture capitalists who said, hey, fertility is making a ton of money and it's slated to make even more money in the coming decades. We're going to start investing in these clinics. So the way the clinics are run is with an eye towards long-term or really short-term investment turnaround so that their investors are receiving profit from it, not necessarily toward providing the best medical care, which can take a long time if done properly and not necessarily make a lot of money for the health providers. Finally, or second, there's the distinction between recommended guidelines and the law. So the fertility industry proudly claims that they are self-regulated, meaning they regulate themselves with little oversight from actual laws. In the United States, there are very few laws governing IVF on the federal level, and on the state level, it's really varied to just what individual states have. Of course, in Alabama, there's now complete blanket immunity for all fertility clinics, which by and large just sort of shuts down any proper accountability with these clinics. And then the final thing to know about the fertility industry is that they're not necessarily focused on healing, but on providing services, which means they're focused on providing the services that can make the most money. In particular, things like pre-implantation genetic testing and other technologies that are currently being tested that really just absolutely disrupt our understanding of human procreation. I mean, I'm happy to chat about those more in Q&A if anyone is curious. But as sort of we wrap up this discussion, there are a few policies that I think are important to point our attention to. The first is looking at a clinic called Rejoice Fertility in Knoxville, Tennessee. They're an outspoken pro-life or life-sparing IVF provider that intentionally does not destroy embryos, does not do pre-implantation genetic testing, and really prioritizes creating a few embryos at a time instead of as many embryos as possible. And their goal is to actually work with science in order to ensure that they're providing women with the best medical care and also honoring and protecting the embryos. That's a model that Germany, Poland, and Italy have largely pioneered and is something that we're really interested in seeing with lawmakers, is how we can practice this life-sparing form of IVF that doesn't submit them to eugenic practices, doesn't mass produce them, but still helps parents overcome their infertility through a myriad of different approaches. So I'll conclude there for Q&A, but thank you all for your time.